Welcome everyone to the Economic and Ethical Arguments for Basic Income session. My name is Michael Howard and I'll be moderating this session. Before we get started, I'd like to give a brief overview on how to use Crowdcast for the audience. If you'd like to submit a question to the speakers, please post in the Ask a Question section down below. You may also vote on questions already posted by other attendees. This will help us to determine which questions to prioritize. Next, there is a chat box on the right-hand side where you can hold side conversations. This is where we will also post any links and supplemental information. In order to keep things moving, we may not get around to responding to any activity in the chat. So please be sure to submit in questions using the Ask a Question function. We'll try to take a couple of questions after the first speaker and then other questions at the end after the second speaker because the papers are really quite different. So let me now introduce the speakers today. Alex Howlett has been studying basic income since 2011. He's the founder of Project Gresham and the originator of consumer monetary theory. He's a proponent of Perry Maring's money view perspective on the economics of money and banking. And he works with the Freiburg Institute for Basic Income Studies financing UBI project. He also hosts the Boston Basic Income podcast with Derek Van Gorder, which is the official podcast of USBIG. Karl Widerquist is a professor of philosophy at Georgetown University, Qatar. He holds 2 doctorates, one in political theory from Oxford and one in economics from the City University of New York. He specializes in distributive justice, the ethics of who has what. He has published more than 20 scholarly articles and 9 books, including The Prehistory of Private Property, from which we'll be drawing today, and A Critical Analysis of Basic Income Experiments. He was a founding editor of the journal Basic Income Studies. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Alex.
All right, thanks, Mike. So my talk is going to get a little bit into the weeds of some stuff that's a little bit complicated. So if there's one thing I want you to take away from this talk, it's that basic income is a simple solution to a simple problem: how to provide money to consumers. So every large-scale economy must provide consumers with money, and in the absence of basic income, we use less reliable and less efficient mechanisms for this purpose. Instead of basic income, today's governments attempt to provide consumers money through expansionary monetary policy that stimulates the financial sector and keeps people employed. This arrangement causes an unstable expansion of private credit that leaves the economy susceptible to financial crises. In a world with basic income, a global pandemic need not trigger an economic crisis. Basic income allows us to bring the economy into a state of orderly hibernation in which we minimize employment and only produce the necessaries. The pandemic has called attention to the reality that the way we get people their money is broken. By providing money directly, basic income bypasses the financial sector, eliminates the need to overemploy people, and allows us to stabilize credit conditions. So if basic income supporters understand one thing, it's that our economy could be doing a better job of serving the people. Money gives people access to the economy's products. Without an efficient money distribution mechanism, the economy will fail to generate the maximum benefit for the people. Basic income, a regular income unconditionally paid to every person, is a straightforward way to get people their money. It can be hard to see, though, how a simple basic income fits into our complicated economy. But the very complexity that makes basic income difficult to reason about stems from the far-reaching negative consequences of our failure to distribute money properly, efficiently. Unsurprisingly, basic income is often criticized as a naive attempt at a blanket fix for a whole host of complex social and economic problems that we fail to fully understand. And I agree that we fail to fully understand a lot of these complex social and economic problems. And there are indeed problems that basic income does not solve, but it can fix the way we get people their money. Now, money, what are we talking about when we talk about money? Basic income is about giving people money, but what is money? What are we talking about here? Money is our shared pricing and payments standard. Markets set prices in terms of the standard money unit that everyone understands. You know, we set prices in dollars, and then standard value money tokens provide a convenient means to pay those prices. We spend $5 to claim $5 worth of the economy's output. To buy things, though, people must have a source of money. And a money source, such as basic income, allows people to claim goods and services that the economy produces for their benefit. So the economy exists to serve the people, not the other way around. It produces goods and services that people want and need. This means that the most important role that people play in the economy is the role of consumer, the receiver of benefit, rather than the worker, the producer of the goods. Economists, though, sometimes imagine a world in which everyone produces something useful, and then they all make themselves better off by trading the products of their labor with each other. In this world, money merely serves to facilitate efficient trade, and the market plays matchmaker for producers who seek to buy each other's products. People buy each other's products using the money they receive from selling their own products. But that's not how the real world works. In the real world, it is often convenient for some people to produce more than they consume. These producers are happy to continue to accumulate money as they churn out goods and services. You can imagine Amazon is sucking up all of our money while we're sucking down all of the goods and services, right? This is great as long as we have the money for Amazon to suck up. So it implies, though, that money is always flowing towards producers and away from consumers. Consumers need a source of money to sustain their spending. People can reap the product of the economy only to the extent that they have the money to claim it. So consumers spend money to claim economic output. They activate production by pumping money through the economy. The flow of money from consumers to producers corresponds to a flow of goods and services moving in the opposite direction. The economy's overall pattern of money flow is probably too complicated for us to make complete sense of. But to ascertain how well the economy serves the people, we need only consider the flow between consumers and producers. We can call this cross-section or slice of the economy that exists between consumers and producers the productive slice of the economy. What happens outside of the slice matters only insofar as it affects what happens within the slice, because we care about people. So to serve its function as a pricing and payment standard, the purchasing power of money must remain reasonably stable over time, especially in the short term. The flow of consumer spending through the productive slice of the economy must therefore remain balanced with the flow of goods and services that it claims. Producers generally try to set prices that earn them the most profit. Price level stability at the level of the macroeconomy, everything, implies that in aggregate, it is profitable for producers neither to raise nor lower their prices. So I'm going to share a diagram here. This diagram that I'm about to share is the most important diagram in basic income, according to me. And anytime I'm talking about basic income, I have this graph in the back of my head. So what's going on here? I'm going to quickly go over what we're looking at. Hold on a second. There we go. So we've got two axes here. We've got the vertical axis is the price level, and then P bar is the output price level. So that's the average price of the goods and services that you buy, and then I bar is the input price level. So that's the price of the resources that go into producing goods and services. And the horizontal axis is the quantity of economic output. And the kind of diagonal line there, that's the aggregate demand curve. So the lower line shows what our economy looks like right now, and the higher line shows what the economy looks like in a world with basic income. So demand, if you're not familiar, it represents a relationship between price and quantity. So at a given price, how much stuff are people going to buy? Obviously, if they have more money, they're going to buy more stuff. So in the above diagram, the shaded area, in this diagram, it's not above, the shaded area represents profit. So producers choose to maximize the price-quantity combination along the aggregate demand curve, actually I should say it like that, that maximizes this area. So you can see that if the demand curve is steeper, the price-quantity combination that maximizes their profit is going to correspond with a lower quantity. And if the aggregate demand curve is shallower, if people's purchasing power or spending patterns are more evenly distributed, then the quantity that producers will settle on is going to be higher. So you can only reach the full potential of the economy if consumer spending power is more evenly distributed. That's kind of the gist of this. And we can get into this diagram later, but this diagram is like, it's always in my mind anytime I'm thinking about basic income. And just keep in mind that because the price level is fixed, only the quantity can adjust. The sensitivity of aggregate demand to changes in price is what determines the total level of economic output. Oh, and I labeled this the price elasticity of demand. That's just a fancy way of saying, like, if you lower your prices, how much is the quantity going to change? If you raise your prices, how much is the quantity going to change? So the distribution of consumer income is what shapes aggregate demand, and the economy will only produce goods and services for the people who have money to buy them. This is true even if we allow the nominal price level to move. You might be asking, well, what if we allow the price level to go way down and increase the quantity that way? And the answer is that you could do that, but then everything would just kind of adjust again, because the real price level is always fixed. You know, the purchasing power of money would just change and everything would end up being the same again. So you really need to adjust the distribution of consumer incomes there. So I'm going to close this share now. So there are also finite resources available to produce the goods and services that people want and need. The economy is producing the maximum benefit for the people when the resource constraint is the constraint that binds. While it's true that the economic output is constrained by resource availability, it is not true that using up or fully employing all of our available resources implies that we have achieved maximum economic output or the maximum benefit from the economy. Unless we can promise that all of our resources are always employed to maximum efficiency, using up inputs does not automatically translate to producing output. So money is debt. Because money is a promise for something, it is a form of debt. So it's a promise for goods and services, right? It's a claim on the economy's output. The money that the government issues is public sector debt. This is why when the government spends more than it taxes, the national debt increases. Similarly, money issued by financial institutions is private sector debt. So your bank deposits are a form of private sector debt even. Now, the money that consumers spend into the productive slice of the economy ultimately derives from some combination of private debt and public debt. The market allocates private debt according to the profit-seeking behavior of individual actors in the private financial sector. By contrast, the political motivations are what determines where the government directs its spending. And the balance between private and public debt, together with the allocation of public spending, ultimately determines the distribution of consumer income. And that determines the shape of aggregate demand. Now, the problem here is that profit-seeking institutions they're just seeking profit. They're not going to automatically distribute money to people in a way that benefits them the most. Only the government can do that. So if you're relying on the private sector to distribute the economy's money, you're not going to get a distribution that maximally benefits the people. So that's now we're talking about basic income. Basic income is the government distributing money to people, and then once the money is distributed efficiently, that allows the market to distribute the resources and the goods and services according to the money that people spend. Now, the problem is that typically the central bank's monetary policy is who's tasked with maintaining price level stability. Whatever pattern of taxing and spending the government chooses to undertake, the central bank must respond in a way that keeps consumer spending balanced with economic output. A limitation of monetary policy is that it operates entirely through the private financial sector. And private debt is notoriously unstable. It depends on a network of interconnected debt obligations, where if one of them fails, if I fail to pay you, then you might fail to pay the next person. And if there's enough of a buildup of private credit, then that creates instability in the private financial sector, where you can have kind of a cascade of failed promises. And that's what a financial collapse is. If you use public debt to push money to consumers, then you're not going to have this problem. So there's this trade-off between, okay, the government can distribute money more efficiently in terms of consumers having access to the economy's output, but then you also get this financial stability that you're not going to get with the status quo of pushing money to people through the private financial sector. So basic income essentially ends the business cycle. By providing money directly to consumers through basic income, the government can allow the central bank to tighten credit conditions. And through automatic monetary tightening, it induces a sufficiently high basic income induces stability. It allows us to tighten the private credit and eliminates the cycle of booms and recessions that we take for granted as a normal part of how the economy works. So ordinarily, the financial system can help us fund productive investment, and that's great. But by using it as a tool for pushing money to consumers and propping up demand, we have caused the financial system to spin out of control. And the business cycle is a consequence of the broken way that we get people their money. So that's it. That's my talk.
Great, thank you. And I think we've got at least one question. The question, I'll read it. How do we ensure that a basic income would not then see an increase of costs? Therefore, those on basic income would still not be able to live an affordable life.
Yeah, so the question is, what's the optimal level of basic income for the economy? Or I like to ask, what's the maximum level of basic income that the economy can sustain? So certainly there are real resource constraints, right? You can imagine a world in which we can't provide people a decent living for free. We just can't afford to do that, right? And then the level of basic income that we could sustain might be below some minimum subsistence level or something like that. I don't think it is below that level. But the idea is, basic income is a way of getting people money. It's not a particular amount. It's an even amount of money to everyone. And the idea is that what we don't want to have happen is we don't want to be using the financial sector, overstimulating the financial sector to create jobs as a way of pushing money to people, right? Because the financial sector is supposed to be for productive investment, and jobs are supposed to be like, why do we have jobs? We have jobs because there's work that we want done that isn't going to get done if we don't pay people to do it. So neither one of these things are supposed to be tools for pushing money to consumers, but that's how we use them. So now we have this inefficiency where we're employing people as a way of pushing money to people. We have pro-employment policies and stuff like that, which would be unnecessary in a world where we're getting people their money through basic income, and we've overstimulated the financial sector, which causes this instability. So yeah, if we set the level of basic income too high, then you're right, we're going to get inflation, and that inflation will continue until it brings the purchasing power of the basic income down to a level that the economy can sustain.
It looks like we have a second question from Diane Pagan. Hi, Alex. Yeah. Can you envision a way to get commercial institutions to factor in proper and fair treatment of human beings into their money-making enterprises? I believe now they are trying to convince the public they are doing this by creating social responsibility departments, but I'm seeing better outcomes for regular people.
So that's just marketing. That's not a real thing. The social responsibility is just to get people like us to say, like, oh, these businesses care about us, therefore we will buy from them, right? They have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders, and they can't even do this unless they justify it in profit terms, right? Like, their shareholders will not let them do this. So behind the scenes, they're justifying these actions as a form of marketing. It's not a real thing. And we don't want necessarily, or we don't need to necessarily, to get institutions to think about humanitarian concerns. What we want is, from the macroeconomic level, we want to adjust the incentives in the economy so that what's the most profitable thing to do is also going to be the thing that benefits people the most. And basic income is not the complete solution to that, but it's part of it, right? Because if ordinary people are the people who have the money, then producing things that they want and need is going to be, the thing that's most profitable. So basic income helps align the profit incentives of businesses with what's good for ordinary people.
Okay, we now have a question from Floyd Marinescu. How does basic income tighten credit markets? Sorry, yes. That part, I thought credit markets chase property speculation and is linked to that.
Yeah, and can you keep this question up, because I want to look at it before you click it away. Actually, I can copy and paste it. Yeah, so this is an important question. So the simple answer is that, what does basic income trade off against? What are we doing it instead of? So currently, the mechanisms that we use to push money to consumers involve overstimulating the financial sector and easing credit markets, right? So if you have a basic income, if you have a direct way of providing money to consumers, you don't need to overstimulate financial markets anymore. So that allows us to tighten credit conditions. And it even forces us to tighten credit conditions, right? It forces the central bank to tighten monetary policy, because if you do the basic income without tightening the monetary policy, then you get inflation. So it's just the natural response that the central bank, if you push the basic income high enough, the natural response that the central bank will be to tighten credit conditions. As far as the housing market or speculative markets go, yeah, I mean, you're gonna you're going to rein in asset bubbles, and you're going to cause a collapse of asset bubbles. And particularly in the housing market, you should expect to see housing prices come way down under a basic income, not just because of tighter credit conditions and higher costs of mortgages, but also because people now have income streams that are not tied to a particular location. So income that's not tied to a job is also not tied to a location, so people have more freedom to choose where to live, and that's going to help out the housing market as well.
Okay, and we have a question from Adrian. What are your thoughts on issues such as rent control, which could see people be unable to access goods and services or rights like food and housing due to increasing cost and lack of rent control?
Yeah, I would say rent control is a bad idea. If you want your market to be efficient, then you've got to get the actual market prices down. If you want people to be able to afford things like rent control are fixing prices, and you're pretending that the market isn't what it is, and then you have shortages, and new people can't move in. It creates all kinds of distortions. So I'd say get the market working efficiently, and then you don't even need to think about something like rent control. And rent control is just a band-aid. It's not actually going to fix the underlying problem. It might make it worse.
And we have a question from, I don't have a name, but the need for stable prices implies to me that cryptocurrencies won't work. Only central banks and the governments with the power to tax have the power to keep prices stable, eh?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that that's right. I would say it's not the power to tax so much, but we do need institutions to push back against market forces that would otherwise push the purchasing power of the currency in one direction or another. So you're right that cryptocurrencies won't work unless they become a fiat currency and we have central banks managing them. Taxes can be part of what helps keep prices stable, but it doesn't need to be the whole. It's not the whole story, and they don't necessarily even need to be part of the story. We have lots of tools, monetary policy tools to stabilize the price level.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. With basic income, we are engaging people to be more productive, but otherwise weren't like maximizing their potential. Is this factor ever considered?
Yeah, sure. So I like to say that most of the important work that we do in our society is not paid. And the labor market is for when you want to pay people to do something different. And you have to do that sometimes. But if we are forcing people to go out and get jobs, then not only are we pulling them away from their leisure time, which doesn't necessarily have to be productive. Like the ultimate goal is the benefit of the people, right? And leisure time, even if it's not productive, is fine. But we might also be pulling them away from productive activities. So in that case, what you're doing is you're forcing people to spend their time unproductively as a way to get them money. And that's just bad all around. They're less happy and they're less productive. So yeah.
Thanks very much, Alex. And I'm going to invite Karl Widerquist back up to the screen now, and we may have a little bit of time at the end for some more questions. So take it away, Karl.
Okay. Hello, that's my dog. It's funny. The video was the audio was not. I didn't mute my audio. I only muted the video. As soon as my video came on, the dog spoke up. She'll quiet down in a minute. It is great to see 55 people logged on here from all over the U.S. and Canada and beyond around the world. This is something we can't do with a purely in-person conference. So it'll be nice to get back to in-person conferences, but I hope we can keep some aspects of the online conference to keep this obvious benefit of it. Okay, so my presentation, which this is the miscellaneous section. This really has nothing to do with what Alex was just talking about in any direct way at all. I am presenting a part of my most recent book, which is part of a two-book series. The first book was called Prehistoric Myths in Modern Political Philosophy by Grant McCall and me. And the second book is called The Prehistory of Private Property. These two books are both dedicated to looking into the philosophical underpinnings of arguments that are usually used against a fair and more egalitarian society, and showing that these philosophical arguments actually are based on false claims about who we are and what our history is and what our prehistory is and where we came from. So in the first book, we debunk what we call the Hobbesian hypothesis, or the mutual advantage hypothesis. And this is the idea that the society that you live in today, the state society with a capitalist economy, is so much better for everyone, for the least, even the least advantage, than our ancient societies were in prehistory, or that you could live on if you joined one of the few tribes, such as the Andaman Islanders, that are still outside of the reach of global capitalism or state society today. That you are so much better off, even the lowest among us. Look, you have flush toilets. You're better off than these other people. The rest really isn't so important. That we're all so much better off, that the system is therefore just simply based on that alone, or just enough, or very close to being just, or that's very important to be just. And that would be great if it was true, but it is false. People who say this portray it as obvious when it cannot be obvious. I don't know what it's like to live on that island in the Andaman Islands. It's that's native peoples. No one has any contact with them. And most of people who make this claim do not know what it's like to be homeless. They do not know what it's like to be struggling on a below poverty income. They do not know what it's like to live in a shanty town and work in a corporation. What we do with this, work in a sweatshop for a corporation that probably made this shirt. And so what we do in this first book is we look at both sides of that argument. We show that people really are making this claim. They really rely on this claim, and it is used in bad ways. It is used to justify colonialism against native peoples, and to use mistreatment, and to justify mistreatment of the least advantaged within our society by claiming you're so much better off than they are. So we go through and we show how it's used, the history of it, and we show that it is demonstrably false by using anthropological and historical evidence. The second book, Prehistory of Private Property, debunks three more claims that have to do with the belief that inequality, well, there's three of them. One is the belief that inequality is natural and inevitable, that there's always going to be inequality, that in any society has it, and if you try to establish equality, you'll get one of two things. You'll get definitely a loss in freedom, and maybe you won't even get equality. You'll just get a new form of tyranny and a loss of freedom. That inequality is the only way to go. Well, people have been making different versions of this inequality hypothesis since the first chiefdoms set themselves up as leaders in 10,000 years ago, and they've thought up a bunch of reasons why it's natural. Oh, the chief, he's appointed by God, or the emperor, he actually is God, or well, we have some people who are the brain people and other people are like the hand people, or we have a eugenic superiority. You have all these different explanations for why some people are better than others, or some people need to be on top, and they're so incredibly different. They all conflict in each other, but all these unequal societies have some explanation saying that inequality is natural and inevitable. And that much just should make you doubt it. But when you actually look into the anthropological data, as we do in this book, and I cannot explain in a 10-minute session, I can't go into the evidence in the session, so look to the book for it. As we show in the book, that it is simply false. That there are societies that have been observed by anthropology that are very free, and that where we do argue in the book that the least free people in the smallest scale societies observed by anthropology are freer than disadvantaged people in the United States or around the world today. Freer in the sense that they are coerced less. Freer in the most liberal, negative sense of the word. They are freer, and they are also in societies that are very, very equal. the least advantaged people then have done. Now that gets to the second claim in the book, which is I sort of combined two of the claims there in the book. The second one is the market freedom hypothesis, that the market economy is supposedly more consistent with negative freedom than all other economies. And when you monkey with the market economy to try to make it more equal, you say, well, you're promoting maybe a value of equality, and you're promoting a value of opportunity, but what I'm concerned about is freedom. And you're reducing freedom because you're taxing those rich people, and look, that makes them have less freedom. You see, you're taking their freedom away. Well, that is looking at only at part of the story. Actually, if you look at the freedom, the actual freedom from coercion of the people who own nothing or little more than the clothes on their back and a few items, those people are coerced and interfered with when they do the most basic of their functions, including wanting to go to the bathroom, much less wanting to build yourself a house, or start a farm or start a business. You cannot legally do these things unless you first work for somebody who owns resources and save up enough money to get these things to do. So you are coerced with a lot in our society. The market freedom is not, the market society is not the one that most promotes freedom, and taxing the rich to help poor is actually relieving the poor from the interference that they have been facing from the property rights system that exists. And then the final one, number 4, this is the one that we really spend the most time. The book, of course, is called The Prehistory of Private Property. So we actually spend a large time talking about the origin and the development of the private property rights system. And we do this because of this belief that's connected with that freedom belief, that there is some sort of a natural right to property, that private and unequal property develops naturally, that when you're homeless, you own nothing, and Jeff Bezos has $200 billion worth of stuff he can do to serve any of his whims. He can get $200 billion worth of person hours. He can buy that to just serve his whims. Whereas you cannot get the most basic things to serve your needs. That's just natural rights. That's the natural system as the way it develops. And the government, it can come and interfere with that. But interference is going to cause other problems. Interfering is a bad thing. You got to let the natural system go. That's the argument they're used to hearing. And even a lot of people who are left of center will take that as given. Okay, we got this natural system, but it is worthwhile to change that natural system in order to meet these equity goals. Well, we shouldn't be taking this system as natural. And so what we do in this book is go through and look at what are they saying? Why are they saying this is natural? Well, generally they tell a story that they know to be false, a story that John Locke told in 1689 of a man who goes out into the woods and he clears the land and he plants crops and improves the land. And he says, this is mine. It will be forever mine. I will leave it to my children. And if they want, they can sell it to someone else. And that is how the world got filled with property. And that's why we have to respect the property rights of Jeff Bezos today, because it all happened through this natural process. Now, they're not saying that Jeff Bezos actually bought his property from somebody who bought it from somebody who bought it from somebody who actually homesteaded the land. But what they're saying, because they know that's false, but what they're saying is this is the system that would develop naturally if it wasn't for governments and other people just interfering with it and taking away the rights of the appropriators. Well, if that was true, then we would be, if a look at history would show continuous attempts for people to appropriate land and create that Lockean sort of story to say, I cleared the land, this is mine, and I won't share it with anybody else, and unless you buy it. And then, but then you got these bad old chiefs and lords would be interfering with them. You'd see all these thwarted attempts, lots of violence against the private property owners by collectors. And you see very much, you see, when you actually look at history, you see the very opposite. The first people to go out in the woods and appropriate land do it collectively. Hunter-gatherers go out as groups. Groups that are villages or smaller, just a nomadic band of maybe 50 people, go out and hunt and gather and share the land and even share most of the proceeds they get. You got 2 spears, somebody needs a spear, you got to give them a spear. You got to give them a spear, you can't camp with us, go camp by yourself, see how well that works. Now, so it will work for a while actually, but it won't work forever. Then what you get when, well, what about the first agriculturalists? Maybe the first agriculturalists created private property. But actually, the first agriculturists did very much the same thing. The oldest known type of agriculture is Swidden agriculture, where you go into the woods, you burn down a small piece of it, not burn down the whole woods, burn down a small piece of it, put the stuff in there, make a nice mulch, and plant land. And you don't do that by yourself. You do that with a group of several hundred people. And we find, and anthropologists have witnessed people doing this kind of agriculture, and invariably they do it together. They think of the land as joint, and they share out, and everyone gets a plot that they can grow stuff on. But the plot you get next year might not be the same plot you got this year, and there's no inheritance or anything like that. And there are people taking care of each other when one person falls short, and there tends to be an enormous commons. The hunting, the land that they don't burn around there is a common hunting or grazing land. And you find this pattern. You find villages like this in native communities in the United States, in peasant communities in Europe, in peasant communities in India and Africa, right up to the entry of the modern era, when you get, now in the cities, you've maybe got something more recognizable as private property has developed by this time. But that does not begin with appropriation either. That begins from the top down with the king saying, this is my private domain. And then, and my queen and my other queen and my other queen, they get private domains. And then some of my underlings are going to get private domains. That's how private property gets started, from the top down. And when you see these many villages that 500 years ago were so common, what got rid of them was state violence. In Europe, it was called the enclosure movement, where the state took these villages and say, that's not actually your land. You're just tenants. I know you've been doing this for thousands of years, but actually the guy in the manor that we appointed to look over you, he owns the land. He's the actual owner. So he can just kick you off when he wants. So you can go to the cities. There's jobs for you there. And that's part of the motivation. It wasn't just that they wanted the land. They also wanted the labor of the people they kicked off the land. And they did this in Europe through the enclosure movement. They ran around the world through the colonial movement and established the private property rights system. There is nothing natural about the unequal property rights system that we have. It was established by state violence in order to help privileged people. It continues to function that way. Our states are protecting it on the behalf of better off people. And they are limiting redistribution of it, not because that protects freedom or natural rights. They're limiting it because that's what the wealthiest people want, and that's who the state is protecting. And we need, therefore, a system that is going to redistribute some of this property and give us all the access to the land that was taken away from it. And one of the things we suggest in the book is basic income. Basic income comes up at the end of both books, just briefly. This is more ammunition for a basic income supporter. This is more ammunition against people, against attacks on basic income. But the connection to basic income was quite clear. This is a very good argument to compensate people for all that they've lost in all the things that I've mentioned, and to preserve their freedom and give them some decent opportunities they're missing. Okay, we only have five minutes left, but I did manage to end in time for at least some questions.
Thank you, Karl. And let me read the first question from Alan Zundel. Both arguments you debunk are used to justify capitalism. If they are false, which I believe, where does that leave us as to how to organize a modern economy?
Okay, well, one thing I should say, don't take my word for it that they're false. Read the books and look at the evidence we present. And if you have, if you have time for all that, of course, if you have time for that, look at the evidence we present. And if you have time for that, look at the evidence deeper. If you're skeptical about it, definitely look. We have a lot of sources, a lot of evidence. We're not asking anybody to take our word for it. We're asking for skepticism. Now, it implies that there is something wrong with the market economy as we have today. It certainly does not imply that all things that reject the market economy are better, because we did not have a market economy 500 years ago, but we also had a very oppressive economy. Village agriculture can be very jointly satisfying, but also it can be oppressive if you get a lord on top that starts making everybody else serfs. So even the village agriculture is easily made into a oppressive system. And some of the alternatives have been as bad or worse. Soviet communism actually completed the destruction of the village agricultural system as it existed in Russia. Not all village agriculture, we have this idea of the Russian serfs. There were a lot of Russian serfs, but not all villages were like that. Some of the villages was actually still pretty autonomous when the Soviets got there. And that collectivization was really just another form of the enclosure movement. So it's not really an argument for or against the market. It is an argument against the inequality that we have now, and something that we have to be done about that. And I think it is an empirical question. I think we should start by taking property off its pedestal and realizing that property is something that governments create, and they should be creating it only for the good of everyone. If we can give you more, that's because it's going to benefit the people who have less. And if you're going to do that, you've got to have some sort of a basic income so the people who have less end up getting. So we start with regulations on the economy and redistribution towards those who have less, maybe bigger parks, maybe greater people's control of the atmosphere and the water system that sustains all of us. There's a lot of different things you can do from these observations, but whatever it has to be, it has to have one that gives real power to the least advantage, not fake power like the Soviets gave to the least advantage.
Okay, the next question is from Giselle Huff. How do you view the Platonic notion that separates the governing function of philosopher-king from the economic function based on the inherent abilities and passions of individuals?
What was the last part? The first part, the philosopher-king, the governing power of the philosopher-king, and the second part?
Second part was, how do you separate that governing function from the economic function based on the inherent abilities and passions of individuals?
The inherent abilities and actions of the
passions of individuals.
Of the individuals. Well, I think that is one of the problems that we're having with democracy in the world today. I can't believe people are actually actually taking what's happening today as some sort of evidence against democracy, when in fact all of this is happening because we're falling short of actually creating a democracy. And democracy is something really hard to create. Plato, and to a lesser extent Aristotle, were very skeptical about democracy because of just that. They didn't think that people were philosopher kings that could run things. They were afraid that if you had democracy, then these massive amounts of poor people would just take from the rich, and that would destroy everything that we've built. But as we've attempted to build democracy, what we found is that the people that she's talking about, these economic passions, dominate the system, but they dominate it from the top. We try to create democracy, and we end up with the oligarchy, or the rule of the wealthy, aristocracy, and because money ends up controlling politics. We need to find ways to get money out of politics. Really, any of the many basic reforms that people talk about that are so easy to do economically and so difficult to do politically simply because the wealthy control our politics today. They don't make the votes, but they have the campaign contributions, the lobbyists that create so much control, not just in the United States, but to a greater extent here than a lot of other countries.
We are actually right at the end of the time, and I want to thank Alex and Karl for this amazing cutting-edge thinking. I hope they'll be able to join some of us in the Kumo space, which the link should be coming up. There it is in the chat. If you enjoyed this session, we've got a lot more coming up, so check out the conference website and the full schedule. The next keynote sessions are the intersectionality of basic income at 2 p.m. Eastern and pilots, data, and the drive toward cash policies at 5 p.m. Eastern. Thank you all for coming, and hope to see you later.
Thank you.
Definitely hit me up.
Hopefully I'll be around. I'll be around as much as I can during the weekend if anybody wants to talk more. Notice that Alex answered 6 questions and I only answered 2 because he gave really brief to the point answers and I gave really long-winded answers. So, you know, when you're presenting, you might want to think about that.
If you're not happy with any of my answers, let me know.
Might want to be more like Alex.
Thank you both and see you all.
See you all later.